The harsh, painful sound of coughing echoed through the small apartment, cutting through the thin walls like sharp blades. Ethan slowly opened his eyes, his small 7-year-old body curled up under a thin, worn blanket. For a moment, he lay still, wishing it was just a nightmare. But reality, as always, was unforgiving. "Mom?" he called, his trembling voice breaking the silence that followed the coughing. There was no answer, only the distant sound of a car passing by outside and the relentless ticking of the old clock on the wall. Ethan got up, his bare feet touching the cold floor. He shivered, not just from the cold, but from the weight of responsibilities no child should bear. He walked to the room next door, his heart tight with fear of what he might find. "Mom?" he called again, slowly opening the door. Mary was there, sitting on the edge of the bed, her shoulders slumped and her head down. When she looked up, Ethan saw the face he loved so much, but it looked paler and more tired with each passing day. "Good morning, my love," Mary said with a weak smile, her voice hoarse. "Sorry if I woke you." Ethan ran to her, wrapping her in a tight hug. "It's okay, Mom. Are you feeling better today?" Mary stroked her son's hair, trying to hide the pain in her eyes. "I am, sweetheart. Don't worry." But Ethan knew. He always knew. "I'll make you some tea," he said, taking on the role of caregiver with a maturity far beyond his years. In the small kitchen, Ethan stretched to reach the cupboard, grabbing the last tea bag. His hands trembled slightly as he boiled the water. From across the apartment, he heard the sound of shuffling footsteps. "Vick?" he called. His older sister appeared in the kitchen doorway, her eyes still heavy with sleep. At 11 years old, Vick carried the same burden as Ethan, maybe even more. "Hey, little guy," she said, ruffling his hair. "Already getting things ready?" Ethan nodded, biting his lip to hold back the tears threatening to fall. "Mom doesn't seem well today." Vick sighed, pulling her brother into a hug. "It'll be okay. We'll get the money for her medicine, I promise." Ethan clung to his sister, seeking comfort and strength. When they parted, he turned his attention back to the tea, determined to do something, anything to help. A few minutes later, with a steaming cup in his hands, Ethan returned to his mother's room. Mary was now lying down, her eyes closed, breathing heavily. "Mom?" he called softly. "I brought you some tea." Mary opened her eyes, love shining through the pain. "Thank you, my angel. What would I do without you?" As he helped his mother sit up and drink the tea, Ethan felt the weight of the world on his small shoulders. He glanced at the picture on the nightstand. His father, smiling, strong and healthy. An image from a past that seemed farther away each day. "Dad," Ethan thought, "why did you have to leave us?" Silence was his only answer. Vick appeared in the doorway, already dressed to leave. "Ethan, we need to go. The flowers won't sell themselves." Ethan nodded, giving his mother one last hug before going to get dressed. He grabbed his worn-out coat, a gift from his father a long time ago. It was faded and too small now, but it was all he had. Before leaving, Ethan stopped once more in front of his father's picture. He touched the cold glass of the frame, the words stuck in his throat. "Let's go, Ethan!" Vick's voice called him back to reality. With one last look at his mother, who had fallen asleep again, Ethan followed his sister out of the apartment. The streets of Atlanta awaited them, indifferent to the drama unfolding inside that small home. Another day of struggle began for the siblings. Vanessa Devent, far too young to carry such heavy burdens, but with no choice but to press on. The sun had barely risen when Vick and Ethan emerged from the dark alley where they lived. The city of Atlanta was already pulsing with life, indifferent to the two small figures moving like shadows among the hurried passersby. Vick gripped Ethan's hand tightly, her thin fingers intertwined with her brother's, as if she feared he might disappear if she let go. Her eyes, far too old for her 11 years, scanned the streets with the wariness of a cornered animal. "Ethan?" she whispered, pulling her brother closer as they dodged a group of suited executives. "Do you remember what I taught you?" The 7-year-old boy looked up, his big brown eyes filled with a mix of fear and determination. "Yes, Vick. Always smile and be polite." "That's right," she nodded, a sad smile playing on her lips. "And what else?" Ethan furrowed his brow, concentrating. Don't make eye contact for too long, and don't push if they say no." "Good boy," Vick praised, ruffling her brother's hair with her free hand. They reached a busy intersection, where luxury cars lined up in endless rows. Vick felt Ethan stiffen beside her. "Are you scared?" she asked softly. Ethan hesitated, then nodded, his eyes fixed on the ground. Vick knelt in front of him, ignoring the curious and sometimes disdainful looks from the pedestrians around them. "Hey, look at me," she said, gently lifting his chin. "It's okay to be scared. I get scared sometimes too." Ethan's eyes widened in surprise. "You do?" "Of course I do," Vick smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach her tired eyes. "But you know what keeps me going?" Ethan shook his head. "Thinking about Mom, how much she needs us, how every flower we sell is one step closer to making her smile again." Vick picked up one of the wilted flowers they had gathered from the park the night before. "See this flower? It might look small and fragile, but it's strong. It grew through the concrete, faced the wind and the rain. Just like us, Ethan. We're small, but we're strong." Ethan took the flower, twirling it between his fingers. "We're strong," he repeated, as if testing the words. "That's right," Vick smiled, standing up. "Now, do you want to see how it's done?" Ethan nodded, clutching the flower against his chest. Vick took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and with a smile she had practiced thousands of times, approached the first car in line. The window was closed, but she could see a well-dressed woman at the wheel, talking on her phone. Gently, Vick tapped on the glass. The woman glanced over, clear irritation on her face. For a moment, Vick felt the urge to retreat, to grab Ethan and run back to the dark alley. But the thought of her mother, lying in bed, coughing up blood, kept her steady. The woman lowered the window, just a crack. "What do you want?" she asked sharply. Vick gave her brightest smile. "Good morning, ma'am. Would you like to buy a flower? They're just $2, and it would really help my family." The woman looked at her watch, then at the still red light. With an exasperated sigh, she reached for her purse. "Fine, but make it quick." Vick felt a wave of relief wash over her. She took the $2 bill, carefully handing over the flower. "Thank you so much, ma'am. Have a great day." As she turned around, she saw Ethan watching everything with wide eyes. "See?" she said, showing him the bill. "It's not that hard. Want to try the next car?" Ethan swallowed hard but nodded bravely. "Remember," Vick said, guiding him to the next car, "smile and be polite. You've got this." As Ethan timidly approached the car, Vick felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to protect him, to keep him away from the streets, from cruel people, from the cold and the hunger. But there was no choice. Not when every penny meant another day with their mother alive. "Excuse me, sir." Ethan's small voice reached her ears. "Would you like to buy a flower?" Vick watched, her heart heavy, as her little brother faced the harsh world around them. A single tear slipped down her face, quickly wiped away. There was no time for tears. Not when there were so many flowers to sell and a mother to save. The rain poured relentlessly over Atlanta, turning the streets into turbulent rivers of concrete. Ethan, soaked to the bone, shivered under the awning of a closed shop. His small purple hands from the cold clutched the last flower he had left to sell. A wilted, sad daisy, as out of place as the boy himself on that gray afternoon. "Vick," he murmured to himself, his teeth chattering. "Where are you?" His sister had gone to find shelter somewhere else, promising to return soon. But soon felt like an eternity to a 7-year-old boy, alone in the storm. It was then that Ethan saw her, an elderly woman struggling against the wind, her umbrella turning inside out with every gust. She walked with difficulty, precariously balancing on a cane. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. The woman stepped into a puddle, her foot slipped on the wet sidewalk, and she began to fall. Without thinking twice, Ethan dropped his precious flower and ran. His bare feet slapped against the wet asphalt, splashing water everywhere. He reached the woman just in time, his small hands grabbing her arm, preventing her from hitting the ground hard. "Careful, ma'am!" Ethan shouted, his voice nearly lost in the roar of the rain. The elderly woman, still stunned, looked at the boy with wide eyes of surprise. "Oh my goodness," she gasped. You saved me from a terrible fall, young man." Ethan, trembling even more now as the adrenaline began to fade, just nodded. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice faltering from the cold. The woman straightened up, leaning on her cane and Ethan's shoulder. "Thanks to you, I am," she said, a gentle smile lighting up her wrinkled face. Then she truly noticed the state of the boy, soaked, shivering, barefoot. "But you, my dear, don't seem well at all. Where are your parents?" Ethan lowered his eyes, the question hitting him like a punch in the stomach. My mom is sick, he murmured. And my dad. His voice trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The woman's expression softened with understanding and compassion. "Oh, you poor boy," she said softly. "Come on, let's get out of this rain." She guided Ethan back to the awning where he had been before. There, sheltered from the worst of the storm, she knelt down to his eye level, ignoring the protest of her old joints. "What's your name, dear?" she asked. "Ethan," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "Ethan," she repeated with a warm smile. "What a lovely name. I'm Eleanor. Dr. Eleanor, actually, though I'm retired now." She paused, studying the boy's face. "Ethan, you said your mother is sick. Can you tell me more about that?" The words spilled out of Ethan like a dam breaking. He spoke about his mother's persistent cough, how she grew weaker by the day, and how he and Vick sold flowers to try and buy medicine. As he talked, Ethan noticed something on the ground. His last flower, the wilted daisy he had dropped in his rush to help Dr. Eleanor. He picked it up, twirling the thin stem between his fingers. "Was that for selling?" Dr. Eleanor asked gently. Ethan nodded, tears mixing with the rain on his face. "Well," Dr. Eleanor said, rummaging through her purse, "I think it's my turn to do something for you, Ethan." She pulled out a $20 bill. "I would love to buy that flower." Ethan's eyes widened. But it's just a flower, and it's not even pretty." Dr. Eleanor smiled, taking the daisy carefully. "Oh, but it's beautiful, Ethan. Do you know why? Because it reminds me of you. Small, but strong enough to survive the storm." Ethan took the bill with trembling hands, hardly believing what he was seeing. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Doc," Eleanor placed a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Now, tell me where you live, Ethan. I'd love to visit your mother. Maybe I can help." At that moment, as if responding to a cue, the rain began to ease. A timid ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, lighting up Ethan's face. And for the first time in a long while, the boy felt something he had almost forgotten: hope. The tiny apartment felt even smaller with Dr. Eleanor's imposing presence. Ethan and Vick huddled in a corner, watching with a mix of hope and fear, as the retired doctor examined their mother. Mary, lying on the worn-out bed that took up most of the one-bedroom space, was coughing uncontrollably. Each spasm seemed to shake her frail body, and Ethan had to fight the urge to run to her. "How long has this cough been going on, Mary?" "Doctor." Eleanor's voice was gentle but professional. Mary tried to speak, but another coughing fit stopped her. It was Vick who answered, her voice trembling slightly. "It started about 6 months ago. At first we thought it was just a cold, but..." She swallowed hard, unable to finish. Dr. Eleanor nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. She turned to Mary, taking out her stethoscope. "Mary, I'm going to listen to your lungs now, okay? Try to breathe deeply if you can." Mary nodded weakly, closing her eyes as Dr. Eleanor placed the stethoscope on her back. The silence in the room was oppressive, broken only by the sound of Mary's labored breathing. Ethan squeezed Vick's hand, his big eyes fixed on the scene in front of them. "She's going to get better, right, Vick?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Vick didn't answer immediately. Her eyes were full of unshed tears, and she was biting her lip so hard it nearly bled. "I don't know, Ethan," she finally whispered back. "But we have to hope." Dr. Eleanor finished her examination and sat down on the edge of the bed. Her face was serious, but there was a glimmer of determination in her eyes. "Mary," she began, taking the sick woman's hand, "you have a severe case of pneumonia. That's why you've been struggling to breathe." Mary closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her pale face. I knew it was something bad," she said, her voice hoarse. "But we didn't have the money for a doctor. I couldn't take the little that Ethan and Vick earned for medicine." Dr. Eleanor squeezed her hand. "You need proper treatment, Mary. Antibiotics, inhalations, maybe even a short hospital stay." At the mention of the hospital, Ethan couldn't hold back anymore. He ran to the bed, throwing himself into his mother's arms. "No, Mom, you can't go. You can't leave us," he sobbed, clinging to her as if his life depended on it. Mary held her son as tightly as she could, her own tears mixing with his. "Shh, my love. It's okay. Mommy's not going anywhere." Vick moved closer, more slowly, her face a mask of fear and worry. "But how are we going to pay for all this?" she asked, her voice breaking. Dr. Eleanor stood up, placing a gentle hand on Vick's shoulder. Don't worry about that right now. I have some contacts at the hospital. We'll get your mother the treatment she needs. Vick looked at the doctor, her eyes filling with tears of gratitude. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why are you helping us? Dr. Eleanor smiled, a smile full of compassion and determination. Because it's the right thing to do, and because your brother showed me that there's still kindness in this world, even in the most unexpected places. Mary coughed again, weaker this time. Ethan snuggled closer to her, as if he could protect her with his small body. What happens now? Mary asked, her voice tired but carrying a hint of hope that hadn't been there before. Dr. Eleanor took out her phone. Now, we get you admitted to the hospital and start treatment. And as for you two, she said, looking at Ethan and Vick, you're going to need to be very strong. Can you do that for your mother? Ethan and Vick exchanged a glance, years of struggle and survival reflected in their young eyes. Then, in unison, they nodded. Yes, Vick said, her voice firm despite the tears. We can do anything for our mom. As Dr. Eleanor made her calls, Ethan, Vick, and Mary remained huddled together on the small bed. The future was still uncertain, full of challenges and unknown fears. But for the first time in a long while, there was also a ray of hope shining through the dark clouds that had overshadowed their lives for so long. The sound of fists pounding violently on the door echoed through the small apartment, startling Vick. She glanced over at Ethan, who was sleeping fitfully on the worn-out couch, his forehead glistening with sweat from the fever. Open this door right now! Mr. Grimes's rough, irritated voice boomed through the thin wood. I know you're in there. Vick felt her heart race. With trembling hands, she opened the door, leaving just a crack. Mr. Grimes, she began, trying to keep her voice steady. Please, keep your voice down. My brother is sick, and I don't care. The burly man shoved the door open, nearly knocking Vick over. His eyes scanned the apartment until they landed on Ethan. Where's your mother? And where's my money? Vick positioned herself between the landlord and her brother. Our mom is in the hospital, Mr. Grimes. She's really sick, but as soon as she gets better, no more excuses, he roared, his face turning red with anger. You're 3 months behind on rent. Either you pay by the end of the week, or you're out on the street. His shout woke Ethan, who sat up abruptly, eyes wide with fear. Vick, he called, his voice hoarse from illness. It's okay, Ethan, Vick said, not taking her eyes off the landlord. Mr. Grimes, please give us more time. I'll work extra hours, sell more flowers, do whatever it takes. The man snorted. I don't care how you get the money. I just want it by Friday, or I'm calling the cops to throw you out. With one final look of disdain, he stormed out, slamming the door so hard the frame shook. Vick collapsed to the floor, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling down her face. Ethan stumbled off the couch and wobbled over to her. Vick? He called again, his voice small and scared. What are we going to do? She pulled her brother into a tight hug, feeling the heat of his fever against her chest. Don't worry, Ethan. I'll figure something out. We always do, don't we? But as she held her sick brother, Vick felt the weight of the world crushing her young shoulders. How could she care for Ethan, pay the rent, and still buy food? And what if their mom needed more medicine? The next morning, Vick woke before the sun. She looked at Ethan, who was finally sleeping peacefully, his fever having subsided a bit during the night. I'm sorry, little brother, she whispered, kissing his forehead. I promise I'll be back soon. The streets of Atlanta were cold and unwelcoming at that hour. Vick pulled her thin coat tight around her body, shivering as she walked to the park. She needed to gather more flowers before the gardeners arrived. Hours passed. The sun rose high in the sky, and Vick stayed on the streets, approaching car after car at the stoplights. Flowers, sir? Just $1, she begged, her stomach growling with hunger. Some ignored her completely. Others looked at her with pity but drove on. A well-dressed man rolled down the window of his luxurious car. Shouldn't you be in school, young lady? He asked, his voice a mix of disapproval and concern. Vick swallowed hard. I had to miss today, sir. My family. The man shook his head. I don't want to hear it. Here, he handed her a $5 bill. Buy yourself something to eat and go home. Vick took the money with trembling hands. Thank you, sir. God bless you. As the car pulled away, Vick looked at the bill in her hand. $5. It would barely buy bread and milk for Ethan. She still needed so much more for rent. Guilt gnawed at her. She should be in school, like the man said. She should be taking care of Ethan. But what choice did she have? As the sun began to set, Vick finally made her way home. Her legs ached, her throat was dry from talking, and her eyes burned with unshed tears. When she opened the apartment door, she found Ethan curled up on the couch, shivering under a thin blanket. "Vick," he whimpered, "you were gone so long. I got scared." She rushed to hug him, feeling his feverish body against hers. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I'm sorry I took so long. Sorry I left you alone. Sorry I'm not strong enough." The words came out between sobs, years of fear and responsibility finally spilling over. Even in his sickness, Ethan gently stroked his sister's hair. "Don't cry, Vick," he whispered. "You're the strongest person I know." In that moment, huddled together on the worn-out couch, the two siblings cried together. They cried for their mother in the hospital, for the father they had lost, for the childhood that had been stolen from them. And in the silence of the night, they prayed for a miracle that seemed further away with each passing day. The dark hallway of the building echoed with hesitant footsteps. Vick, exhausted after another long day on the streets, stopped in front of the apartment door, surprised to see a small package on the ground. Her heart raced. Could it be an eviction notice? With trembling hands, she picked up the package. A note was attached to it. "To Vick and Ethan, you are not alone. Mrs. Rodriguez, apt to 3B. Inside the package, Vick found a still warm container of homemade soup and a small bag of fresh bread. The delicious aroma made her stomach growl painfully, reminding her that she hadn't eaten in days so Ethan could have the little food they managed to get. Silent tears streamed down Vick's face as she opened the door. Ethan was curled up on the couch, still recovering from the flu, his eyes lighting up as soon as he saw her. "Vick, you won't believe it!" he exclaimed, his voice still hoarse but filled with an excitement she hadn't heard in weeks. "Mrs. Jenkins from the 5th floor came by and brought me medicine, and Mr. Thompson from downstairs said he'll help us with rent this month." Vick stood frozen, the soup still in her hands. "What? But how? Why?" Ethan smiled, a genuine smile that made Vick's heart ache. "They said they heard about Mom and about us. They said they wanted to help." At that moment, a soft knock on the door interrupted them. Vick opened it to find the kind face of Mrs. Patel, an elderly neighbor they barely knew. "Hello, dears," she said, her Indian accent full of warmth. "I made some cupcakes and thought I'd bring you some. And, well, I'd like to offer to watch Ethan tomorrow if you need to go out, Vick." Vick felt her legs go weak. I don't know what to say, Mrs. Patel. It's the least we can do," the woman interrupted gently. "You know, when my husband passed away last year, it was the small gestures from the neighbors that kept me going. Now it's my turn to give back." As Mrs. Patel came in, explaining to Ethan how to make the perfect frosting for cupcakes, Vick's phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Eleanor. "Vick, an online fundraiser was created to help your family. We've already raised nearly half of what you need for rent. Don't give up, dear. The community is behind you." Vick's legs finally gave out, and she slid to the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Ethan rushed over to hug her, concerned. "Vick, what's wrong? What happened?" Through her tears, Vick showed her brother the message. "Ethan, people, they're helping us. I don't understand. Why? Why would they care about us?" Mrs. Patel knelt beside them, placing a comforting hand on Vick's shoulder. "Because that's what a community does, dear. We take care of each other." That night, the once cold and lonely apartment was full of life. Neighbors came and went, bringing food, clothes, and even some toys for Ethan. Mr. Grimes, the grumpy landlord, showed up with an embarrassed expression. I came to tell you that you can stay," he muttered, avoiding Vick's gaze, "at least until your mom recovers. And, well, if you need anything." Vick, still overwhelmed by so much kindness, could only nod, unable to find the words to respond. Later, when most of the neighbors had left, Vick and Ethan sat on the couch, surrounded by gifts and leftover food. "Vick," Ethan whispered, his eyes heavy with sleep, "do you think Mom would be proud of us?" Vick pulled her brother close, kissing the top of his head. "I'm sure she would, Ethan. And you know what? I think Dad would be proud too." As Ethan fell asleep in her arms, Vick looked out the window at the city lights. The future was still uncertain, The challenge is still immense, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. On the table, Vick's phone lit up with a new notification from the fundraiser. Another donation had come in, accompanied by a message. To Vick and Ethan, "You are the future of this city. Stay strong. We are with you." Vick closed her eyes, letting the tears, this time of gratitude and relief, fall freely. The journey ahead would still be long and difficult, but now they had something they had lost for so long: hope. In the small town where Mary and her children struggled to survive, autumn painted the trees in shades of gold and red. Mary sat on the worn-out porch of their rented house, watching the leaves slowly fall as she held a cup of tea in her trembling hands. "Mom?" Vick's voice broke the silence. "Are you okay?" Mary forced a smile, turning to her daughter. "Yes, sweetheart. Just a bit tired from yesterday's chemotherapy." Vick sat beside her mother, her eyes reflecting a mix of worry and hope. "The doctor said the treatment is working, right?" "Yes, it is," Mary replied, her voice soft. "But we still have a long road ahead." At that moment, Ethan came running out of the house, his eyes glowing with excitement. "Mom? Vick, look what Mrs. Thompson gave me." He held up a pair of new shoes, clearly used but in good condition. Mary felt a lump in her throat. The community's generosity touched her deeply, but it also made her feel helpless, unable to provide these things for her own children. "They're beautiful, Ethan," she said, fighting back tears. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Mary sat at the kitchen table, papers scattered in front of her. Medical bills, late rent notices, and job flyers mixed together in a chaotic pile of overwhelming responsibilities. She picked up one of the job flyers, her hands trembling slightly. "Store clerk. Part-time," she murmured to herself. The thought of working, even for a few hours, felt like an insurmountable mountain in her current state. But what choice did she have? A sudden sound made her look up. Vick stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her wide eyes fixed on the papers spread across the table. "Mom, you can't work right now," Vick said, her voice trembling. "You can barely stand after chemo." Mary sighed deeply. "Vick, sweetheart, we need the money. The bills just keep coming." Vick walked over and took her mother's hand. "I can get a job after school. Maybe at Mr. Johnson's diner?" "No," Mary replied firmly, squeezing her daughter's hand. "Your job is to study. You have a bright future ahead of you." The words had barely left her mouth when a violent cough overtook her. Vick rushed to get water, panic clear in her movements. When the coughing fit finally subsided, Mary looked at her daughter, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I should be stronger for you." Vick hugged her mother tightly. "You're the strongest person I know, Mom. We're going to get through this together." That night, lying in her bed, Mary stared at the ceiling, her worries weighing on her like a heavy blanket. The fear of the future, the uncertainty of the treatment, the constant struggle to keep a roof over their heads, it all consumed her. She turned over, muffling a sob into her pillow so as not to wake the children. In moments like this, the absence of the children's father, who had abandoned them years ago, felt even more painful. How could she carry all this weight alone? The morning sun filtered through the faded curtains of Mary's small apartment, casting a soft light on her tired face as she slept on the couch. She had spent the night awake, battling the nausea brought on by chemotherapy and the constant worry over the growing pile of bills. A white envelope on the coffee table caught her attention. With trembling hands, Mary opened it, her eyes quickly scanning the typed lines. Tears began to roll down her pale cheeks. "Vick? Ethan?" She called, her voice choked with emotion. The two teenagers rushed into the room, fear evident in their eyes. "Mom, what is it?" Vick asked, kneeling by the couch. Mary handed the letter to her daughter, unable to speak. Vick read it aloud, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Dear Miss Victoria Evans, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected to receive a full scholarship to Westbrook Preparatory School." "You did it, Vick!" Ethan shouted, hugging his sister tightly. Vick stood still, her eyes fixed on her mother. "But what about you, Mom? And the bills? I can't leave you." Mary took her daughter's hands, her face a mix of pride and determination. "Yes, you can. This is your chance, sweetheart. We'll manage." In the weeks that followed, Vick's scholarship news seemed to breathe new life into the family. Inspired by his sister, Ethan threw himself into his studies with renewed energy. The community, touched by the family's struggles, organized a fundraiser to help cover Ethan's school supplies. One Saturday afternoon, Mary watched her children studying at the kitchen table. Her body still ached, but there was a new strength in her eyes. "Kids," she called softly, "I have some news." Vick and Ethan looked up, expectant. "I got a part-time job at the local library," Mary announced, a shy smile on her lips. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan was the first to break it. "But Mom, are you sure?" "Your health." Mary raised her hand, cutting him off. "I know it'll be hard, but Dr. Thompson said I'm making good progress, and besides, it's a quiet job, just a few hours a day." Vick stood up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Mom, I can delay school, get a job?" "Absolutely not," Mary replied firmly. "You two are going to study and build a better future. This is my battle to fight." That night, after the kids had gone to bed, Mary sat on the porch, staring at the stars. The weight of responsibility still pressed on her shoulders, but for the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. A coughing fit shook her, a brutal reminder of her fragility. When it passed, she wiped away a lone tear. The road ahead was still long and uncertain, but she was determined to keep fighting. For Vick, for Ethan, for herself. In the room next door, Vick lay awake, listening to her mother's coughing. Silently, she made a promise to herself. She would make every second of this opportunity count, no matter the cost. For her mother, for Ethan, for her future. The autumn sun bathed the busy avenue in a golden light as Ethan and Vick stood at the familiar intersection. The traffic light, which once set the rhythm of their daily survival, now blinked indifferently to the transformation that had taken place in their lives. Ethan, now 15, held a bouquet of yellow daisies, his face marked by a thin scar, a reminder of a particularly tough night in the past. Vick, at 17, carried white roses, her eyes tired but determined. "Do you remember the first time we came here?" Ethan murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Vick nodded, swallowing hard. "How could I forget? You could barely reach the car windows." A car stopped at the red light. Ethan approached, offering a daisy and a card to the surprised driver. "What's this, kid?" the man asked, suspicious. "It's a thank you, sir," Ethan replied, his voice trembling slightly, "for all the kindness we found here." The driver, confused, took the flower. As he read the card, his eyes widened in recognition. "Wait, you're those kids who—" The light changed, cutting the conversation short. The man drove off, looking at them in the rearview mirror with a stunned expression. Vick walked over to her brother, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You okay?" Ethan nodded, but his eyes were wet. "It's just, I remember how many times we stood here, cold and hungry, while Mom was in the hospital." Vick hugged him tightly, her own tears threatening to fall. "I know, Eth. I know." As the day wore on, they continued their mission. Each flower they handed out carried a story. The old lady who gave them coats in the winter, the student who shared his lunch, the police officer who pretended not to see them selling without a license. As the sun began to set, a familiar figure approached. Dr. Eleanor, with her white coat and gentle eyes, stopped in front of them. "Hello, kids," she said softly. "Or should I say young adults?" Vick smiled and handed her a white rose. "Dr. Eleanor, this is for you." The doctor accepted the flower, her eyes glistening with emotion. "You didn't have to." "We did," Ethan interrupted, his voice steady. "Without you, without everyone, we wouldn't be here today." Dr. Eleanor read the card, her hands trembling slightly. "How's your mom?" Vick's smile faltered for a moment. She's still fighting, but she's stronger now. She's even back to working part-time at the library." "And what about you two?" the doctor asked, her voice filled with concern. Ethan glanced at the traffic light, now blinking in the twilight. "We're here, aren't we? A year ago, I never thought we'd make it this far." Vick wrapped an arm around her brother's shoulders. "We still have a long way to go, but now we know we're not alone." Dr. Eleanor looked at them, a mixture of pride and sadness in her eyes. "You two are incredible. You know that? So young, and you've already been through so much." The tears Ethan had been holding back all day finally spilled over. "Sometimes I'm still so scared. Scared of losing Mom. Scared we won't make it." Vick hugged him tighter, her own tears falling silently. Dr. Eleanor joined the embrace, wrapping her arms around both of them. There, on the sidewalk, under the dim glow of the streetlight that had just flickered on, three souls connected through pain and hope. The traffic continued around them, indifferent to the quiet drama unfolding. But for Ethan and Vick, that moment marked another step in their journey. A journey of struggle, tears, but also a resilient and fragile hope. The end. Did you enjoy reading about the daily struggles Vick and Ethan faced? Fortunately, in many places across this country, we have strong and united communities. Tell me, is your community like this? Would you help Vick and Ethan too? Kisses, and see you in the next story.